Thank you. Cool, we good?
Okay. Bit of a new setup today because I managed to get inside an A220 for the sole purpose of making this video. Definitely not because I was going anywhere. I originally had some poorly planned joke about the end of the year, holidays, gifts, and how the A220 was a gift to Airbus. But I got COVID, couldn't edit for a week, and so this video will be released in 2022. And that joke doesn't make sense anymore.
Anyway, the A220 or C-Series. I originally wanted to make a video diving deep into the future of the C-Series, such as the exciting potential to replace the A320 family. But that video would take longer to make, and I wanted to get something out over the break. This part 1 is therefore a bit of a bonus video. And yes, I'm aware that it probably will be over 20 minutes long, so I guess I played myself. We'll explore the tumultuous history of the C-Series, why it was sold to Airbus, and where it stands today, helping us understand the context for the exciting future of what's to come next. I'm splitting this video into 3 parts: how and why the C-Series was created, sale to Airbus, and where it stands today. Before we really get started, in the spirit of gifts, I'm actually giving away one of these hoodies. That's my way of saying thank you for supporting the channel this year. To enter, all you have to do is just leave a comment saying you're interested, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and also join our mailing list at theflyingmoose.net. I'll leave a link in the description. I'll ship to anywhere in the US and Canada, and if you're beyond that, I might have to visit you in person. With that, let's dive into the story of the C-Series. There's a fair bit to cover here, so we'll first look at why the C-Series was created, and then the actual creation process. Let's jump back to the early 2000s, because the first rumblings of the C-Series started at the turn of the century. If you visited any airport with domestic traffic in 2004, you'd have seen these. Short-haul travel made up around 25% of air passengers within the US, holding steady at around 5 million passengers. This meant a steady stream of DC-9s, Fokker 100s, and Boeing 737s. But these were old planes. The DC-9 first flew in 1965, almost a full 4 decades prior. They were loud and fuel-hungry, and with oil prices edging higher and higher, airlines had begun poking around at potential replacements. Another new development was the structure of routes themselves. The hub-and-spoke model was the dominant flavor of the day, where airlines funneled traffic into major international hubs like JFK and Heathrow to increase network connectivity. However, low-cost carrier upstarts like Allegiant and Southwest had demonstrated that, in some cases at least, the point-to-point model had clear advantages. This divergence in thinking was represented by the 2 biggest projects from the world's largest manufacturers. On one hand, the Boeing 787 was smaller than the 777, embracing the new direct point-to-point mindset by offering a fuel-efficient twin-jet that would be easy to fill and could span far-flung, long and thin routes like Houston to Auckland. On the other hand, the Airbus A380 doubled down on the hub-and-spoke. With 2 full decks and typical seating for over 500 passengers, the A380 was built around shuttling passengers between large hubs. These 2 key developments, aging narrow-body fleets and a potential shift towards point-to-point travel, set the backdrop for Bombardier. While Boeing and Airbus were duking it out for international dominance, there seemed to be a gap opening up at the lower end. Short-haul jets needed to be replaced soon, and there was a real possibility that airlines wanted to push them farther and faster than ever before. According to Gary Scott, president of the Bombardier New Commercial Aircraft program, initial projections showed that the market for 100 to 150 passenger commercial aircraft was estimated at around $250 billion US, or 6,000 aircraft over the next 20 years, and this is from 2005. Given that nobody was developing such an aircraft, Bombardier confidently asserted their goal of capturing half this market over the ensuing 20 years. Some initial specifications were set based on what Bombardier estimated would be in demand, and there would be 2 versions of the C-Series, the smaller one carrying 110 to 115 passengers, and the larger one carrying between 130 and 135 passengers, over a range of around 3,200 nautical miles. The state of the company itself shed some light on the internal motivations behind launching the C-Series. At this point in time, Bombardier had 3 primary business lines: aerospace, which made planes; capital, which followed in GE's footsteps of being an industrial company offering financial services, and this never really turns out that well. The third was transportation, which made these things. They'd actually just divested their military operations in 2003 and were in the midst of cutting around 6,500 jobs en route to scaling back their European operations related to the transportation division. Their finances had become bloated and the company wasn't profitable at the time. This gives us our first glimpse into the internal workings and financial state of Bombardier, and it definitely won't be the last. Focusing on the aerospace line, Bombardier was heavily invested in building regional transports, like their immensely popular Canada Regional Jet or CRJ line. They also produced the well-liked Global Express and Challenger business jets, rounding out a solid if unspectacular product line. Bombardier had no experience building something on the scale of the C-Series, both in terms of physical size and business ambition. They would be leaving the safe, familiar harbor of regional jets, launching themselves into direct competition with heavyweights Boeing and Airbus, who had previously paid little attention to the regional segment. It's hard to say whether Bombardier was ready for this. In some ways, no third party can ever be truly ready to encroach on the territory of a duopoly. Bombardier's engineering talent seemed to be their strongest suit, as well as the arguably ample financial leash afforded by provincial and federal governments. And on that last point, the UK government was somehow in on this too. Putting things together, it looked like there would be a sizable market for such an aircraft, and very few manufacturers were looking at bringing clean sheet designs to the space. Bombardier's success with manufacturing small jets must have also given them the confidence that they could pull this off, something that would have placed them in a prime position to dominate a nascent market. The motivations make sense, so let's move to the actual creation process. If nothing else, just take a look at this graphic. Going through each milestone would frankly be a waste of time, so I'll just cover the highlights. Get ready for story time. The C-Series program was launched to much fanfare in May 2005, when the development was valued at a touch over $2 billion. The Quebec, Canadian, and UK governments collectively picked up a third of this bill. The honeymoon didn't last long, however, because just 7 months after the launch announcement, yes, 7 months, the program was paused indefinitely because present market conditions do not justify the launch of the C-Series program at this time. Without firm orders materializing, news sources describe the C-Series R&D costs as a $10 million a month drain that the company simply couldn't afford, not when Embraer was simultaneously gaining ground on the CRJ line. Apart from kicking off what would be the first of many delays, the abrupt cancellation cast doubt on Bombardier's ability to execute on the already ambitious program. Things got even more confusing just a year later, when Bombardier resumed the program in 2007. This start-stop behavior does happen in aircraft design, but more often for internal developments and rarely for programs with established funding from external stakeholders. What followed were a series of setbacks, including the disappointing repatriation of mid-fuselage work from SACC, a Chinese manufacturer, back to Bombardier's in-house plant in Belfast in mid-2012. Commentators noted this spread-out supply chain as a key uncertainty, yet Bombardier stuck to their targets of entry into service by 2013. At this point, the cost of the program had already grown from $2.1 billion to $3.9 billion. 2013 then saw continued struggles with software integration, 2014 had more delays, and 2015 had, you guessed it, another set of delays. The point here isn't to shit on Bombardier. Every major aircraft launch in recent memory has been delayed or over budget in some way. But this is meant to articulate the difficulties faced by the company, launch airlines, and key investors en route to the C-Series entering service. It doesn't inspire confidence. The first C-Series was finally delivered to Swiss in mid-2016, around 3 years behind schedule with a program price tag of around $5.4 billion US, more than double the original forecast. But, and this matters, Swiss liked the aircraft a lot. So did Air Baltic and Korean Air, 3 early launch customers. In fact, they all loved it, and that was a problem for Boeing and Airbus. The C-Series was clearly a compelling product, so how did it end up as part of Airbus? Put simply, a very harsh competitive response, poor market conditions, and a rapidly deteriorating internal environment forced Bombardier's hand. This might be the spiciest section, because the last thing that Boeing and Airbus were going to do was sit back and watch the C-Series cannibalize the 737 and A320 families from the bottom up. The C-Series was finally gaining traction in 2016, and Delta Airlines joined the party with a firm order for 75 of the smaller CS100 model. Despite the deal being nominally worth over $5.3 billion based on list prices of around $70 million per aircraft, industry commentators speculated that Delta only paid around $25 million per aircraft. Despite this, experts agreed that Bombardier needed this Delta order, no matter how much it hurt. Bombardier needed to sweeten the deal for Delta to get them to adopt this clean sheet aircraft. Anytime an airline does this, there's extra costs for retraining and spare parts, to name a few. Ironically, this deal was a near carbon copy of the one that Boeing cut for United on the similar 737-700, where Boeing reportedly sold each 737 for around $22 million. Yet Boeing clearly lost out on the Delta order. This despite the fact that they didn't exactly have a one-to-one alternative to offer. Only the 737-700 was a close comparison, and even that was a little larger. Their response was to file their infamous anti-dumping complaint against Bombardier, a request answered by the US International Trade Commission in the form of duties of nearly 300% on the C-Series. This all but rendered the aircraft unsellable to US airlines, and even Delta put their deal on hold until the tariffs were resolved. Airbus also recognized the clear threat posed by the C-Series, this time to their aging A320 family. They, however, decided to take the less hostile and perhaps more effective route of going head-to-head with the C-Series on the open market. The A320neo family was hastily announced in 2010, with Airbus pledging $1.5 billion towards revamping the A320 with new engines and wings. This would clearly cannibalize some of their existing models, but Airbus leadership understood firsthand how their own company had benefited heavily from Boeing's ignorance to them several decades prior. In some ways, they had no choice but to make the tough decision to compete. It also helped that $1.5 billion to Airbus's balance sheet wasn't anything significant, and from an engineering standpoint, there are far more difficult tasks than re-engineering something. The move worked, with Airbus reportedly blocking several C-Series deals by virtue of offering a better deal, something not too difficult given the manufacturer's financial might and the popularity of the A320. Airbus also brought the A320neo to market before the C-Series was launched, something that shouldn't have happened, but also didn't help Bombardier either. The last thing that Bombardier needed was Boeing and Airbus actively blocking airlines from buying the C-Series, but that's exactly what happened. This hostility only added to the numerous struggles faced by the C-Series, playing a large part in eventually forcing Bombardier to part with the aircraft. By the mid-2010s, the broader market environment had lessened the original appeal of the C-Series slightly, particularly with regards to the key selling point of fuel efficiency. With oil prices no longer outrageously high in the mid-2010s, the fuel-efficient upside of the C-Series may not have been as apparent as it was when the program was launched years earlier. In an ironic twist of fate, next-generation aircraft like the C-Series and the anti-C-Series Neo family also drove down prices for used jets significantly, which now looked a lot less unattractive since fuel was so cheap. Actions of some airlines reflected these shifting priorities. United, for example, agreed to lease A319s in mid-2015 to upgauge their smaller regional jets, despite A319s having near worst-in-class fuel burn. Cheap fuel wouldn't have single-handedly rendered the C-Series unattractive, but low acquisition prices and existing fleet familiarity from operators may have tilted the playing field just enough away from the aircraft to make airlines question the necessity of ordering a brand new C-Series. It's also worth touching on the US market here, since they're so big. American and United both stated in 2019 that they had little interest in the 100-seater market, in stark contrast to Delta's embrace of the C-Series. Some of Delta's enthusiasm plays into the muted responses from AA and United by arguably blocking them from receiving orders, but this thinking, largely driven by low acquisition costs of cheaper A319s for example, would likely have been part of both carriers' ethos in 2015 already, taking two major US carriers off the table for Bombardier. That's just the external side, because while the world was beating down on the C-Series from the outside, Bombardier's internal discord was threatening to upend the project from within. Bombardier was forced to take a $3.2 billion write-down of value in the C-Series program in 2015, largely owing to the issues we just discussed. Combined with a $1.2 billion write-off from the cancellation of another Learjet, Bombardier reported a net loss of $4.9 billion during the third quarter of that year, more than the value of the entire company. Bombardier had a plane, but not the money to build it. The Quebec government threw their weight behind Bombardier with a $1 billion bailout, and the federal government eventually provided another $372.5 million in interest-free loans several years later. These financial woes were projected to last for another 5 years at the very least, with the company saying that another $2 billion would likely be required before the C-Series could support itself. With the government unwilling to provide such sums of money, and private institutions unlikely to trust Bombardier's finances, something would clearly have to give, and soon. Less widely circulated was how Airbus and Bombardier met for discussions surrounding the C-Series in October 2015, a move that may have foreshadowed the eventual partnership. Money was one thing, but Bombardier's inexperience with creating an aircraft of this complexity would prove to be near fatal. As Gary Scott put it, there is just really no substitute to having been there, done that. The company's engineering capabilities, while strong, were already stretched incredibly thin over 3 all-new aircraft designs: the Learjet 85, the Global Business Jets, and then the C-Series. Factor in the latter's far-flung supply chain, and there was a sense that the company had overextended themselves in a major way. A Financial Post article quoted a former executive describing how departments were literally fighting for engineers and money. Among other indicators of inexperience, Bombardier lacked key ancillary services that typically support new aircraft launches, such as dedicated regional sales teams. This was especially critical in the context of breaking the Airbus-Boeing duopoly, as airlines would need to invest heavily in any manufacturer switch, and the lack of sales teams would have been another friction point. And then, the announcement came. In late 2017, Airbus acquired 50.01% of the C-Series program. Bombardier retained 31%, and Investment Quebec held the remaining 19%. With the acquisition done for a nominal $1 and no debt being assumed by Airbus, this was Bombardier's way of addressing their largest cash sink, and a heroic last-ditch attempt in saving the C-Series, even if it took on another name. Apart from taking advantage of Airbus's engineering, financial, and operational might, the presence of a large manufacturer finally brought certainty to the program. With Airbus, airlines could trust that, at the very least, the plane would be made, and someone would be there to service it down the road. Neither could be taken for granted with Bombardier at the helm, with the second point about servicing being particularly detrimental for orders. Planes are about as far as possible from being buy-and-forget objects, and many airlines were rightfully skeptical of ordering from a manufacturer that looked like it might not exist in a year, let alone 5, when repairs would definitely be needed. The cost savings of this deal were also significant. Airbus's credibility and scale would have allowed for more reasonable terms with suppliers, and alongside the aforementioned certainty brought by Airbus, some predicted that aligning the C-Series with Airbus's existing supply chains would shave off 40% of recurring supplier costs. The C-Series could also be produced at Airbus's factory in Alabama, allowing them to skirt the import tariffs originally pressed against the C-Series, which were removed later on, but they didn't know that at that time. The deal came as a surprise to many, but makes sense in hindsight. Only Boeing or Airbus could save the C-Series from, well, Boeing or Airbus, and Boeing seemed downright allergic to the plane. Bombardier was running out of options, so despite talks that previously went nowhere, the C-Series was finally renamed the A220. It's now the beginning of 2022, and for all the turmoil faced by the C-Series, it's become a remarkable success. In this section, we'll explore where the C-Series is today. This includes use cases, how passengers and airlines like the aircraft, and short-term demand drivers for the crossover jet market. I'm taking the time to cover these topics because it'll set the stage for exploring the future of the A220 in the next video. Can't predict the future without understanding what's happening right now. The original engineering team at Bombardier must feel vindicated, knowing that their plane went from inhabiting the Bermuda Triangle of airplanes to exceeding their pre-COVID flight operations. Demand for A220s is so high that a new order today won't be delivered until 2026, and Airbus is trying to increase production rates from 5 a month to 14 a month by 2025.
It's been a great development, we love the aircraft, and we're very, very satisfied.
As of now, December 2021, 650 firm orders have been placed with 186 deliveries made. 12 operators spread out over all the continents except Latin America employ the A220, with Delta, Air Baltic, Swiss, Air Canada, and Egypt Air heading up the top 5 largest operators. I feel that the most interesting reflection of how much airlines enjoy the A220 can be found in the novel use cases enabled by the aircraft. The A220 performs like a mainline jet, but with substantially better economics, offering ranges close to 4,000 nautical miles at this point, with near best-in-class fuel burn. This has opened up long and thin routes that push the definition of the phrase to new extremes. JetBlue between Boston and San Jose, for example, 6 hours and 40 minutes. Air Canada between Montreal and San Francisco, 6.5 hours, and I took this one. It was very comfortable.
Okay, so I'm at the gate, and I just missed my flight.
Mark Gallardo, VP of Network Planning at Air Canada, captures this concept succinctly. The aircraft is a game changer for the carrier, being perfectly sized and ranged for the Canadian context, and opening up new long and thin routes overseas. The flexibility afforded by the A220 has captured the imaginations of other key players like Air France and JetBlue, as well as upstarts like London City-based Odyssey and David Neilman's Breeze. The latter two carriers are building their fleet solely around the A220, a vote of confidence that I think demonstrates better than anything just how well received the plane has been. As an added bonus, the CEO of Air Baltic is type rated on the A220, so even he loves the plane that much that he'll actually be flying it on some routes. The consensus is that everyone loves it. It's hard to quantify these things, but airline review site Flight Report aggregated its contributors' rankings and found that the A220 beats similar jets handily, especially the A320s and 737s it probably will end up replacing. Anecdotally, established sites like 1 Mile at a Time have raved about the plane, and I have to say that my personal experience backs these claims up. I took an A220 from Montreal to San Francisco in November, and it was a very pleasant flight. It wasn't life-changing, and it's still a narrow body, but it honestly felt more like a wide body than an A320. There are a couple of objective reasons for this. The A220 only has 5 passengers abreast in economy, resulting in more space per seat. The 2-3 configuration then means that only 20% of passengers are in the middle seat, compared to 33% in a typical 3-3 layout. The windows are also larger than those in the A320 or 737. In fact, it's comparable to a 787 window. Or maybe it's just the fact that these planes are new. Either way, you'll be hard-pressed to find a strictly negative experience with the A220. Passengers like it. Before getting into the long-term future of the A220, as we will in our next video, there will almost certainly be immense activity surrounding the aircraft in the coming year. Any major development will take this into account. So let's take a quick look at 2 key reasons why airlines would want to buy the A220 right now today. Established carriers are unlikely to grow their fleets in the immediate term due to suppressed air travel demand from the pandemic, meaning that demand for A220s will primarily be driven by fleet renewals. In a similar vein to Qantas's selection of the aircraft as part of a larger Airbus order to replace their aging 737s. The pandemic has actually been good for fleet renewals, especially for replacing 737s and A320s, most of which are pushing a quarter of a century in the air. United, Air France, and Delta are just some of the big names that recognize how the future will be different from the past, and that their narrow-body fleets need to change as a result. However, despite the operational benefits of the A220, there are major airlines that will likely renew fleets with older models for the foreseeable future. The lower acquisition costs and existing fleet familiarity of A320s have won over AA and United, for example. This trend is reflected by the number of new A220 orders seen since 2018, and only 20 orders replaced this past calendar year. This isn't necessarily a knock on the aircraft, but illustrates how demand might be capped in the near future. Even if Bombardier's initial projections for 6,000 aircraft holds true, the general estimate is that 2,000 or so will be from direct renewals of smaller A320s and 737s, and that number will be spread out over 20 years. Some surprising new carriers born during the pandemic have chosen the A220 as their launchpad, most notably Breeze, but these upstarts themselves are unlikely to drive significant demand compared to fleet renewals. If the mathematical limits of fleet renewals caps the short-term upside of the A220, right-sizing helps balance that, bringing some benefits in the near term. The pandemic has significantly curbed enthusiasm for travel, pushing airlines to be more selective with costs. Right-sizing has therefore become more prevalent as carriers try to squeeze any semblance of profitability out of their routes. This concept describes the matching of capacity with current and typically reduced levels of demand. It might sound simple, but it basically means utilizing aircraft that are neither too large nor too small. It's not a new concept, gaining some popularity after the financial crisis in 2008. But there's a key difference now according to industry commentators. Aviation consultancy True Nord notes that, in the past, lower capacity aircraft did achieve lower overall trip costs, but the per seat costs were actually greater. Whereas a new generation of crossover jets, including the A220, actually offer lower per seat costs, resulting in significant savings. In a COVID context, this makes the A220 an ideal aircraft to lead recoveries. As airlines rethink their fleet plans in 2022, a combination of renewals and right-sizing may push them towards the A220 over larger alternatives like the A320neo. However, these are just short-term demand drivers at the end of the day, and more concrete changes to the market and aircraft will likely come sooner rather than later.
The A220 program has been through a lot, and it's a small wonder that we're talking about it today at all. The aircraft is finally hitting its stride, where the politics have calmed down, the finances have stabilized, and the plane can do what it was built to do, which is fly. A stretched version seems like a question of when, not if, and Airbus might be setting up the A220 to replace the A320 family altogether. If that happens, the A220 would truly have the power to reshape networks, making good on Bombardier's original promise to produce a true game changer. But what do you think will happen next for the A220? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive into the future of the C-Series in more depth. Don't forget to also check out the hoodie giveaway and join our Facebook group to continue the conversation. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and here's to a great 2022 for everyone.